Hi everyone, my name's Chris. I am presenting Cecilia's paper, Dynamic Moral Hazard in Nonlinear Health Insurance Contracts. Many moons ago, I had a paper that estimated insurance-induced moral hazard, and at some point during that talk, every time there was an old grouchy person who would raise their hand and say that thing that you're talking about, that you're saying is moral hazard, is not actually moral hazard. And I've always had a dream of like just starting my presentation with a slide like this. So now that it's not actually my paper, I'm going to do it. Alright, so if you crack open Moskala, Whiston, and Green, and you find in the appendix where do they talk about moral hazard. Actually, there's a ton of nuance in their statement about what moral hazard is, but what they say is like the first definition of moral hazard was something like this: hidden action by an agent caused by principal's inability to observe how the agent is working. So it was a hidden action problem. For a very long time in healthcare, the terminology of moral hazard has been used to describe the response, like plain and simple, the responsiveness of healthcare spending to insurance. Within that, there are kind of a couple different types of responses to insurance that would lead to an increase in healthcare use. One actually is fairly consistent with the original definition of moral hazard, which has been termed ex ante moral hazard. So this is moral hazard or increased healthcare spending due to reduced effort by the individual who is covered. So this would be like, I have health insurance, therefore I am going to smoke because I don't have to pay the financial costs associated with getting lung cancer. There's very, 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 very little research, empirical research on this form of moral hazard. Pretty much every time you see moral hazard discussed in an empirical paper, they're talking about ex post moral hazard, which really is just price sensitivity. So I admit it, yes, moral hazard in health insurance is just price sensitivity. I'm not apologizing for it, somebody else defined it. Okay, this is also the sandbox that Cecilia is going to be playing in. In thinking about ex post moral hazard, she's going to essentially take this total response in healthcare spending to health insurance, and she's going to decompose it into two components. The first component she's going to call static ex post moral hazard, which you should just think, this is a response to spot prices. So the day that I go to the doctor, the amount of money that I spend out of my pocket, if you charge me less, do I consume more? That would be, in her definition, static ex post moral hazard. She's going to define a new term called dynamic ex post moral hazard, which is an increase in healthcare use in response to lower shadow prices, where spot and shadow prices aren't the same here because of dynamic cost sharing features like deductibles. Okay, so I'll give you an image to help you think about this. On the first image here, on the horizontal axis, we have total healthcare expenditure over the year. On the vertical axis, we have out-of-pocket expenditure. Let's imagine we have a very simple nonlinear health insurance plan that has like a deductible of $1,500, where before the deductible, you pay the full price of care. After the deductible, you pay nothing. Okay, so what that means is that for the first $1,500, you effectively have no coverage. Your out-of-pocket price is exactly, or your out-of-pocket expenditure is exactly equal to total. And then once you cross that $1,500 threshold, you don't pay anything. Okay, so your total expenditure goes up, but you don't pay anything out of pocket. The idea of this nonlinear contract or dynamic moral hazard is that up to this point, where I pay $1,500, there's this additional incentive to go to the doctor. Namely, it brings me closer to a price of zero. All right. So if we would think like if people are forward looking, they're going to respond to that additional incentive in going to the doctor, and they're going to consume more care pre-deductible than they would otherwise. We can think about how that affects spending over the course of the health insurance year then. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to have on the horizontal axis the month of the year. On the vertical axis, I'm going to have your total expenditure. We can imagine someone who has no insurance, and maybe their expenditure over the course of the year looks like this. So like every month they consume a little bit. And then let's impose the same health insurance contract for them. What would their expenditure look like? It might look something like this if they're forward looking. Right, so at the very beginning of the year, they don't really know if they're going to cross their deductible. They're not really internalizing the price benefit of going and consuming care early on. However, as they get closer and closer and closer to that deductible, they start to internalize the idea that, hey, there's this extra benefit of me going to the doctor. It's going to give me lower prices later. And therefore, they start consuming more. Even before they reach the deductible, they start consuming more. All right, so we might say that the difference between the green line and the blue line here at the end of the year, that's total moral hazard. What Cecilia is going to be interested in is decomposing what share of that total moral hazard is due to the static price sensitivity and what part is due to this dynamic moral hazard. the way she's going to do that, she's going to have a model where she can effectively say, well, what if in the model people are myopic, therefore they only respond to spend at the end of the year, and the gap between the black and the blue line, that's going to be my static moral hazard. Everything else is going to be dynamic moral hazard. And what's kind of useful about this picture is you can also see what the source of that dynamic moral hazard is. There's really two things going on. One, because of these dynamic incentives, I consume more care than I would otherwise prior to crossing the deductible. But in addition to that, because of this behavior, I cross the deductible earlier and I spend a longer period of time with lower prices, right? So both of these things are contributing to this dynamic moral hazard. Okay, so from there, I'm gonna kind of sketch out her game plan, and I say pay attention, graduate students, because this is like the textbook gold standard of if you're gonna write a structural paper, like the approach and the layout is perfect. And also, like, for those of you who advise graduate students, like if you have a third year who comes to you and they're like, I've got this idea for a structural model, I need to know what the key ingredients are for if this thing's gonna work, like literally hand them Cecilia's paper and say, follow this game plan, and they will be in good hands. All right, so what are those lessons? Like what are the ingredients to a paper like this? Number one, choose the right data set. She chooses the RAND health insurance experiment data because it has two really nice features that make her life so much easier. One, there's no plans are randomly assigned. She can just totally ignore adverse selection, right? Normally, in all the competing papers in this literature, they're like modeling, or a lot of them are modeling selection into a health insurance plan. She could put her hands up and say, I don't have to worry about that. In addition to that, a lot of the individuals in the RAND health insurance experiment, they faced a dynamic they face a nonlinear contract, okay? Lesson number two, as Maria referenced with Matt's paper, she documents dynamic behavior in the reduced form. So even if you don't believe her structural model, you can see this anticipation of crossing the deductible and a response to that. I'm not gonna show exactly what she does, but the basic takeaways or the basic idea is she shows that below the maximum dollar expenditure, that's like a limit of if you cross this threshold, you owe nothing from now on. She shows that below that, weekly healthcare utilization is increasing in the weeks remaining in the insurance year. That's because the value of crossing that threshold is higher the earlier you are in the year. And in addition to that, weekly healthcare utilization is increasing in your cumulative expenditure. So in other words, the closer and closer you get to that maximum dollar expenditure, the more salient the benefit of crossing it is, therefore there should be a response. Now, particularly with the latter of these two things, you might think this is just serial correlation. This is just like people getting sick, they start spending money, so it looks like they're responding to this threshold, but really they're just getting sick and they start spending money. So she also shows in this that once we get above the threshold, now all of a sudden neither of those effects are there. So it's not serial correlation that's driving this increase in healthcare expenditure, it's actually this anticipatory effects, okay? Lesson number three, write down the simplest structural model that allows you to answer the question that you have. And I'm gonna spend some time on our model here in a few minutes. You're gonna see like it's very, very simple and it gives her the capacity to answer this question. Number four, particularly when you're a graduate student, if you have the capacity to use a fancy estimation technique so that you can show what your skills are, do it. I wish I had the chops to spend a lot of time talking about the fancy estimation technique that she uses. I'm kind of hoping that she's going to come up and talk about it a little bit when I'm done. So this is a strategy that was laid out by Jeremy Fox and co-authors in 2011. It allows for tons and tons and tons of heterogeneity, and the coolest part about it is that you do have to solve the dynamic programming problem a whole bunch of times, but once you've done that, you actually estimate the structural parameters just using OLS, which for anybody who's been in this world before, that's a super enviable position to be in. Lesson number five, this is kind of like standard in virtually all of these, this approach to empirical work. Answer your main question using via counterfactual analysis. So what she's going to do, kind of as described in the previous picture, she's going to estimate total moral hazard by simulating utilization when people are fully insured and when they're not insured. The gap between those two is total moral hazard. She can then do the same thing, but assuming people are myopic, that gives her static moral hazard, and then the gap between those two is going to be our dynamic moral hazard. And then the last lesson of an analysis like this, use the model and estimates to conduct welfare analysis. That's partly so reduced form folks who like hate everything you're doing, they can at least look at it and go, damn it, I can't do that with my models, so I guess I have to appreciate this part of what they're doing. And do that in a way that's related to the exact topic that you're working on. She does that. She studies optimal health insurance design with an emphasis on this role of dynamic moral hazard. Okay, so all of that said, I do want to levy my first critique, which is that in reading the intro, I'm not quite convinced that there's more here, that the motivation is more than a labeling exercise. This term, dynamic moral hazard, it is a new term. That said, like even back in like Keeler, Newhouse, and Phelps 77, in their abstract, they say for a consumer that has a deductible, they act as though they face a shadow price lower than the nominal price in the range below the deductible. So like theoretically, we've known for a very long time that like once someone faces a nonlinear contract, they're going to respond to the shadow price. And given that moral hazard is just price responsiveness, like we've kind of known that in theory for a long time. Moreover, there's plenty of empirical evidence that individuals aren't myopic, and particularly like even in this setting, that like people do respond to these shadow prices. There are a few comments in the paper that are kind of like this. I study a new source of moral hazard that has been overlooked due to the use of annual models, which I'm like super sympathetic to. And there seems to be a suggestion that like if you estimate an annual model of medical care expenditure in response to healthcare characteristics, that you'll like miss this dynamic moral hazard and it won't be in the moral hazard estimates. But I'm just not convinced that that's true. Like at the end of the day, the annual models, they like match their model to data, and in their data, they have like people who have full coverage, people who have no coverage, and the model has to match the fact that there's a gap in spending between those two. So I think like, while they might not be able to explicitly separate static and dynamic moral hazard, I think dynamic moral hazard is still there. Moreover, even in this paper, all of the welfare conclusions that are drawn at the end, they're all based on total moral hazard. So I kind of like am left with the feeling of like when I teach intermediate micro, like I'll teach demand, and then the next lecture is like income and substitution effects. And I reach this point in the lecture where I have to be like, all right, now I'm gonna convince you that it's actually necessary to be able to decompose these two things. And like right now, I don't have the feeling in the paper that it's like, I see that we can decompose the two, but I'm not like convinced that it's necessary. A suggestion, you're gonna see in a second, the model that Cecilia estimates, like it's literally an annual expenditure model from another paper where she breaks it up into many, many smaller pieces. It would be very straightforward for you to estimate that model with just one period instead of 52 periods. And then you could show me like, are the moral hazard estimates different? And is the welfare analysis any different? Even if you don't, even like say there's a reason you can't do that, even if you don't do that, I would say like you at least need to show me that like your moral hazard estimates are somehow different from all of these ones that are generated by the literature, particularly the literature that like uses RAND data, right? Okay, so with the data, hopefully most people are familiar with the RAND health insurance experiment. It was run from 74 to 82. Families were randomized into a health insurance plan, and they stayed in it for 3 to 5 years. You should think of the plans, for the most part, varying along 3 dimensions. So they were given a co-insurance rate, so this is the percentage that they had to pay out of pocket. So a large fraction of people actually just got free care, so 0% paid out of pocket. 25, 50, and 95%. They were randomized into a maximum dollar expenditure. This is, if you cross this threshold, you owe nothing now. There was a cap at $1,000, but otherwise you were randomized into 5, 10, or 15% of your income. And then finally, the starting date within the year was randomized. So all the plans were a year-long health insurance plan, but not everybody was like January 1st. And that ends up being useful in a number of dimensions in the analysis. But all of them had 0 deductible, all of them had 0 premium. Ultimately, there are 4,700 family years. That said, about 50% of people are getting free care. In addition to that, you know, in her analysis, everyone's like in for 3 to 5 years. So it'd be nice to know like how many unique families are there that are contributing to the heterogeneity that's being used in the estimates. Also, it's important that lots of people do actually cross this threshold, which is necessary to estimate the dynamic moral hazard. With regard to the structural model, so you should have in mind a decision maker is a family. Time period is an insurance week, so there's 52 in a year. In every period, the main decision that's going to be made is the family is going to receive a health shock. Think of that kind of as being like a shock in terms of dollars, and then they have to choose how many dollars they're going to spend in response to that shock. Families are heterogeneous along 5 dimensions. So I said they get a shock and she's going to estimate the distribution. So think of mu as shifting the mean of that distribution. Sigma squared is the variance. And then kappa is going to represent the disutility from a doctor's office visit, which is really being identified by the fact that lots of people have $0 in expenditure. And so that's kind of separating average expenditure from the likelihood that you go at all. Also, there's going to be a price sensitivity parameter. And then individuals vary by their income, which is observable unlike the other 4 things. And it, as I said earlier, influences this maximum dollar expenditure. All right, the contemporaneous utility function that she's going to use comes from this Diaz et al. Paper, which is an annual expenditure model. And we can go through the components real quick. So again, this is new. New is my health shock. And C is going to be my expenditure choice. So you can essentially see with this formulation, you're effectively penalized when these differences get away from 0, right? So you're essentially choosing C to try to get those things close to 0. Also, C enters into the out-of-pocket expenditure because it can move you closer to or past. Well, actually, here contemporaneously, it can move you past your deductible. We have to keep up with consumption up to that point, which affects your out-of-pocket expenditure. My price sensitivity parameter is here in omega, which looks a little strange to call that a price sensitivity parameter. I'll show you in a second why it's actually not strange. And then finally, this can be defined for every health insurance plan, which affects the out-of-pocket expenditure amount. Okay, so the first thing to think about, let's think about this omega, the price sensitivity parameter. So assume that an individual faces a linear contract, meaning you just have a coinsurance rate, there is no deductible, right? In this model, if that's the case, then there are no dynamics whatsoever, right? You just face a price and anything you do this period has no impact on next period. Therefore, to find optimal consumption, I can just take a first order condition of this contemporaneous utility function, right? And if I do that, ultimately, I'm either going to spend $0, that would be if my new is negative, or I'm going to basically follow the first order condition, which would say I'm going to spend this many dollars, which is my health shock plus omega times 1 minus the price, right? So you can see that omega's capturing my price sensitivity here. One way to visualize that is if you have no insurance, then my price is going to be 1, so this term's gone. If I have full insurance, my price is going to be 0, so I have my omega, right? So omega is kind of fully capturing my static moral hazard. All right, if we think about how this first order condition then changes, if now we have a non-linear contract, effectively everything about this is the same. It's just that now when I make my choice about how much to consume this period, it's the case that it influences my expected value next period because it might move me closer or move me past my deductible, right? So effectively, my first order condition, it looks the same. It has all the same pieces, except for I have this additional thing here where there is a value associated with consuming more today because it brings me closer to my deductible. And the sum of these two things ends up being my shadow price. Okay? All right, so really nice, really straightforward model. When I then think about the dynamic programming problem, assume that I start knowing beta, so that's effectively my parameters plus income. With that, if I start in the last period, the contract is linear. Crossing the deductible in the 53rd period doesn't matter because the deductible resets, right? So if this guy is 0, then I can effectively, by integrating over the unknown shock, I can calculate exactly what the optimal consumption level is, and therefore I can also calculate the value function. Then and I can do that for every possible level of consumption leading up to that and every possible health insurance. Okay? So if I can do that in the last period, then moving into the previous period, because I can calculate the value function, in the period before that, I can calculate the expected value function, and then therefore the optimal decision in every period before that, moving back to the first period of the year. Okay? So I solve the model backwards that way. second, smaller critique. There are missing dynamics here, right? This is not a model of health investment. This is kind of like a model of aspirin use, right? Every period I get a shock that tells me you don't feel very good. What I have the capacity to do is make a healthcare choice that makes me feel better in that period, but has no implications in terms of my future health. Now that's a little bit of a cheap shot from a masochist who likes to model health production. But so the question is like, why does that matter for this paper where the objective is to think about moral hazard? And there are two reasons. The first, there's this really nice paper by Heisen Lin and Dan Sachs back in 2019, where they show evidence of intertemporal substitution literally using these data. So effectively what they show is take somebody who has free care, compare them to somebody who doesn't have free care, but they cross the MDE. They literally show that the person who crosses the MDE, even though they're both facing the same price, them and the free care, they consume more if they're a person who's crossed their MDE. And what that tells you is that they're substituting future care into the present because it's cheap right now. Okay? So that's not in this model. What that would lead to is inflated static moral hazard this period and inflated dynamic moral hazard in next period because I've substituted that consumption today. At the end of the day, it's not moral hazard, it's all substitution. Okay? Cecilia's thought about that. There's an appendix in the paper that addresses this. It's not in the main estimation, but she's at least thought about it. Where it concerns me more is like the most interesting counterfactual, something that she can do that you can't do with an annual expenditure model, is thinking about the optimal resetting of deductibles and MDEs and whether or not they should be annual or whether or not they should be shorter periods. That's really cool. It's something she can definitely do. That said, the capacity of an individual to substitute intertemporally increases the more frequent the thresholds reset. So in other words, imagine that your deductible reset every single day. Like what would you do in that environment? Any medical care that wasn't urgent, you would just save it up for a period where you were sick, and then you'd buy all your medical care on that day, right? And so I think that substitution definitely would exist, but the model can't capture it. So that's something that I think is worth thinking about. Okay, again, how much time do I have, Matt? Oh, I'm good, okay. Again, the estimation is above my pay grade. I'm gonna try to lay it out in one slide. So the way I would approach estimating a model like this, I would think like, if I fixed my parameters at known levels, I could then solve the dynamic programming problem backward. That would produce a bunch of optimal decision rules. And then from those optimal decision rules, I could like build moments, or if you're an MLE guy like me, you could build choice probabilities by like making a distributional assumption on your new. And from there, I could like have a process where I iterated on beta. Okay, that's what I would do. Cecilia does something that's like way cooler, which she gets from Fox, and then the first time it was kind of like put into action was this Nevo, Turner, and Williams paper. So the idea is, let's assume that the population has H types, okay? And a type is a different vector of these parameters and income, all right? H has to be pre-specified. So the easiest way to conceive of this is, imagine that all of these take something like 5 values. There are then 5 raised to the 5 combinations of those values. Once you have that, and there's like strategic ways to come up with like what's the right range of each and how you pick these things. Once you have that, okay, I'll come back to that in a second. All right. Once you have that, you then could solve the dynamic programming problem for all of those combinations for every plan. That would give you an optimal choice rule for each one of those. From that, you could build moments. So I would have my moment J, this would be like average consumption in period T, conditional on consumption up to that point, conditional on the plan. And so I could have that conditional on H. And then from that, I would have moment based on data, so plan and my moment J, and I'm basically trying to find the minimum distance between that moment and this thing that I calculated from the model, where I'm weighting each one of those model moments by some parameter theta. Okay, that's the idea. And in this world, the objective is actually to estimate my thetas, right? From that, I can do something like construct an average mu or an average sigma, which would be comparable to what you would normally do in this environment. And what's really cool about this is that despite the fact that this model moment is highly nonlinear, this expression is linear in theta. And so what that means is there's a way that you can estimate this just using like OLS, and that's super cool. Okay? The fancy new thing that I was going to point out that I'll move on from, I gave kind of the old way to understand how to come up with this grid of parameters. One of the really cool innovative things that Cecilia does in the paper is she comes up with a way to come up with that grid of parameters that's way smaller than the traditional way of doing it, and therefore both estimations faster and you get better coverage of the parameter space. So hopefully she's going to say something about that. It's too smart for me. Okay. Third and last critique. I wondered, in the parameter set, there was no discount factor. And I wonder if fixing the discount factor assumes dynamic moral hazard, and I'm pretty sure that it does. So again, if this is my optimal decision rule, you can see that the size of the discount factor is going to heavily influence whether or not, and the role that dynamic moral hazard is playing. It's not included in the parameter set. If I assume that it's greater than 0, and the data suggests that there's just static price elasticity, or just static moral hazard, then it seems like the model must produce dynamic moral hazard, right? Because consuming now does in fact move me closer to my threshold. Seems like it has to then say I'm responding to that. There's a simple way to test that. You could just take your data, or you could take your model, you could simulate data assuming that your delta is 0, but that omega is positive, so you are responsive to prices. And then you can go back and you can estimate the model, assuming that your delta is positive. I'm almost positive that you're going to find dynamic moral hazard if you do this, despite the fact that you know that there's not any in the data. In this literature, we tend to run away from estimating discount factors because technically they're non-parametrically non-identified. That's it. Hey, this is a parametric model that she has. In addition to that, at least in my mind, I think it's pretty clear what variation in the data would identify delta separately from omega, right? So, and it's the exact variation that you use in your reduced form analysis, right? So if we're seeing that consumption in period T increases as an individual gets closer and closer to their NDE, that seems like the variation that would identify discounting. Separate from omega, so you can imagine with omega, if I see two people who have the same C, capital C, but they have different coinsurance rates and they behave differently, that tells me about static moral hazard. If I see the same individual if I see two individuals with the same coinsurance rate, but one of them is closer to the threshold, that seems to identify discounting. So I think that's worth spending some time thinking about, can you identify it and are you assuming your answer? Okay, from there I'll say a few things about results. She estimates parameters make sense, all the shares make sense, the model fit is beautiful, all that stuff's great. The main question that she starts with is how large is the role of dynamic moral hazard? So what does she do? She takes her model, she assumes that folks don't have any insurance, forward simulate behavior, that gives you a level of expenditure. Then for the blue line, for all of these different health insurance plans that are observed in the data, she's going to assume they have the health insurance plan, but she's going to set delta equal to 0. So we're assuming that they're myopic, and we forward simulate behavior. The difference between expenditure with and without insurance, that's the height of the blue line. That's our static moral hazard. We then do the same thing, assuming the discount factor, the delta that was used in estimation. We simulate with insurance, we get a total expenditure with insurance and without. That gap is the green line. The gap between the two is dynamic moral hazard. So if you want to think about where is dynamic moral hazard the largest, that's where it's the biggest gap between the blue bar and the green bar. Where does that exist? It exists in places where my threshold, my maximum dollar expenditure, is lower and my co-insurance rate is higher. So in other words, when I'm sitting there at the beginning of the year I can see, like, I'm probably going to attain that threshold, both because it's closer to me, and when I go to the doctor, I'm spending more money. Okay, so it's totally sensible that that's where we would expect to find a larger role for dynamic moral hazard. On average, she's finding that it's about the dynamic moral hazard is about 40% of total moral hazard across these plan population. Okay. Last thing that she does is welfare analysis. I'm going to try to give just like a general sketch of what she's doing. So the way I read it, the goal is to find a single plan, meaning a coinsurance rate, a deductible, an MDE, and a deductible and MDE resetting timeline that maximizes welfare for the average individual. And then she's going to try to decompose how each feature relates to risk protection, dynamic, and static moral hazard, which are the three like kind of contributions to welfare here. She's going to assume care preferences for individuals and that the insurer is risk neutral. At the end of the day, that ends up being important because it effectively means that premiums don't matter when we make the welfare calculation. They're just transfers between the two groups. And then she's going to take this calculation of relative social welfare of Plan J relative to full insurance from a couple other papers, and it ends up having the following breakdown. It's effectively the willingness to pay of the individual for Plan J relative to full insurance. That she's just going to calculate as a difference in two certainty equivalents. So you can think there's an expected utility of being fully insured, there's an expected utility of having Plan J. For both, I can use the model to calculate the certainty equivalent. The gap between those two is willingness to pay for the individual. Okay? The second term is the welfare calculation of the relative social welfare for the provider, which because we have this assumption that effectively means premiums don't matter, it's really just a difference in expected cost for the provider. So we have the expected cost for the provider of Plan J and the expected cost for the provider of full insurance. She shows in the appendix that you can do some algebra and you end up being able to decompose that expression into the relative value of risk protection, the relative social cost of static moral hazard, and the relative social cost of dynamic moral hazard. If you're interested in that, you can go check out the paper, but I'm not going to talk about it here. All right, and here's what like the exercise ends up looking like, okay? So baseline is full insurance. She's going to use the model to simulate behavior and calculate welfare for a whole bunch of different combinations of contracts. So she's going to vary here the coinsurance rate. She's going to vary with each one of these lines the deductible. And the thing that she's holding fixed in this analysis is both the resetting time and she's holding fixed what the MDE is. So she's starting out with a low MDE. Okay? And what we're measuring on the vertical axis is the welfare gain compared to full insurance. And what you can see is that for when there is this low MDE, the welfare maximizing plan has a deductible that's equal to 0. She's then going to compare that to having a medium MDE or a medium out-of-pocket threshold that's twice as high, it's $1,500. And when she does that, you can see that this 0 deductible is no longer the optimal plan. Now we end up with an optimal plan that's different from that. It's a deductible that's higher. Okay, and so this is just a result of the model. This comes out of the estimates and simulation of the model. The big question is why is this? And it's going to turn out that the answer is it relates to dynamic moral hazard. Okay, and she shows this in the following way. Now she's going to, again, fix a low MDE and fix the coinsurance rate, and she's going to show what happens to these three component parts of relative social welfare as I increase the deductible. And you can see when I have a low cap on spending, as my deductible gets closer and closer and closer to that cap, my dynamic moral hazard gets larger. Why is that? It's because when I go to the doctor, I'm paying a larger and larger share of the expense, meaning with each one, it's easier for me to get close to that threshold where I ultimately have to pay nothing, okay? If I have a lower MDE or a lower out-of-pocket threshold, that incentive isn't nearly as salient because I start so far from the threshold to begin. Okay, so the reason that we end up favoring a larger deductible here than here is because of dynamic moral hazard. Okay? All right, so she basically does that exercise that I just showed, focusing on the coinsurance rate, focusing on the deductible, focusing on the MDE, and focusing on the optimal resetting time. The summary of that is that the optimal plan for the average individual has a high deductible, a 40% coinsurance rate, and an MDE that's at least twice the deductible. The analysis regarding optimal resetting time is more nuanced. That basically, what's optimal is fairly heterogeneous, but the basic theme is that the deductible should reset earlier than a year for most. That's best for most people. But again, I kind of worry about intertemporal substitution with that analysis. Okay, I assume I'm out of time. So, great lecture. Thanks for the chance to talk about it.
Okay, so thanks, Chris, for this actually thoughtful exercise of reading my paper as an stranger and someone outside my committee member, giving me feedback. I have some comments and thoughts about, about the suggestions. So I will start with the first one, which is about is this like a labeling exercise, and how do we think about this dynamic moral hazard, given that, back in the 90s, we have, 1970 something, we have already these theoretical papers talking about this possibility. So I want to be transparent. I think I am just giving a name to this behavior that is happening. I am not, the first one who pointed that out. So I want to, first of all, acknowledge that. There is some theoretical papers that already said that. And there is, I guess, here is if I have to say something, I think by using, it's the empirical tool that we have been using that actually prevent us to think about this dynamic moral hazard so far. So in general, when we use annual models of healthcare expenditure, I think that's the tool that actually prevent us to open the black box and say, what is, the myopic versus forward-looking behavior of the agent within the year? And on the other side, what is this uncertainty regarding future health shocks, and what is this generating, right? So I think by using models that are at least have more than one period within the model, we can start seeing the difference between being myopic versus there is some uncertainty in the next period shock. And these two things have been somehow combined through the lens of annual models. So I think I have to make a better effort in the paper to try to say that. Yes, so in that main critique, of course, annual models are trying to match the same data that I'm trying to match with within year models. So actually, Chris suggested a way to somehow differentiate what are we missing if we estimate annual models, or what are the biases that we will get if we estimate annual models versus, a within year model. So I have some preliminary results for that. I have been doing that. I have to say that if the concern is, okay, the annual model will put all part of my dynamic moral hazard will be in what I would say static moral hazard, and if we at the end of the day we only care about welfare, then I don't care if the moral hazard is in the static or in the dynamic component, as long as I capture it in the welfare exercise, right? So according to my preliminary estimates, what I see is that the model is putting, so when I estimate an annual model, what it's doing is it's not just shifting the dynamic moral hazard component to the static one, it's actually putting some pressure on the distribution of health shocks, especially on the second moment, which is the variance. So the intuition is the following. In order to match these static models at the annual level, so from the point of view of the individual, you start the year knowing 100% what is going to be your stream of shocks throughout the year, and you actually take a decision as a maximizing agent, just taking into account the end of year price with certainty. So what does that in the model is that at the end of the day, you either behave so you either choose how much to consume with the coinsurance rate, with the end of year price, which is either the coinsurance rate or zero. So there are only two options. So either you act as if you are in full insurance, because by the end of the year in December, you will be exhausting your cap, so you will be in full insurance, or by the end of the day, you are gonna, end up below the cap, so you're gonna be still paying the coinsurance rate. So what that means is that there will be these two extreme kind of bimodal behavior, that either you behave, as a 20% coinsurance rate guy or as a 0%. So the model is the annual model is gonna rationalize that by actually increasing the variance of the health shocks. So if the problem is, okay, we're not capturing the dynamic moral hazard, but we are attributing all to static, and we're gonna capture it in the welfare, I mean, I would say that's okay. But if we are gonna, put some pressure on other parameters, especially the health distribution, the health shock distribution, that's problematic, because when we move to counterfactuals, then we are not gonna get the full picture, right? The right picture. So this is something I am working on, and thanks for pointing out how I can potentially show it. The second comment was, about the missing dynamics. This is interesting. So there are currently two dynamics that I am missing. First one, I would say, is the healthcare production function within the year. That's tough. That's hard to measure. I just think that the focus of this paper is not in this production of health as a stock. So I will put that in another paper. I'm focusing on that in another paper. However, the dynamic that is relevant to my paper that in the main estimation I'm not currently capturing is this intertemporal substitution that, as Chris said, it's already been documented using my data, the same data, not my data, the run data, that is happening and has been solved. So the way I kind of, in an stylized fashion, I want to capture it is by somehow allowing, this is not in the main estimation, but I am working on that. I have the model, I have been estimating it. So essentially, I am allowing the patient to choose how much to postpone to next year, or shift forward from next year to this year, only in the last period of the model. So ideally you will choose every period, but I have some, for complexity, I am only allowing this to kind of shift from, you can think of shift from December to January, or January to December, but there are some trade-offs. I mean, if you are above the cap and you are in full insurance in December, why you don't go ahead 100% of the time and you forward some expenditure? Well, two things. One, you benefit because of the monetary cost, because next year you will need to pay something out of pocket, but this year you can take advantage of being above the cap. But also, there is some strategic component, which is if you shift forward some spending from next year, that actually decreases your probability of hitting next year cap. So that would be the strategic component. And there's also like a health efficiency. If we believe there is a health production function going on, it's kind of a health efficiency concept that is maybe my screening this year. For some reason, I had like a screening or some preventive care checkup timed for January, and it's not as efficient if I do it earlier, right? So I have been dealing with those trade-offs and trying to, in an stylized fashion, show that. If anything, I think if I don't include this intertemporal substitution, it's actually biased towards zero, my dynamic moral hazard, because this intertemporal substitution, I think, has a dynamic moral hazard component that if I add it, I will actually, increase the size of the dynamic moral hazard, but I cannot conclude any, I don't have definitive conclusions for that because I have been working with this model. The last thing is about the discount factor. Yes, sorry, I haven't been transparent in the paper. I am setting the discount factor. So I am setting, I think, at the annual, whatever is the annualized for 0.2095. I have to say that maybe I have the right variation to estimate it. I have played around with the estimation in grad school, and I didn't have like good results. But what I'm definitely will do is at least show some sensitivity analysis by changing, the discount factor. But I will be curious to talk more about what are your thoughts of the sources of variation, and if I can show something reduced form that can be credible for the model. Other than that, I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, this is really cool. I may have missed it, but are you able to figure out in like there are papers that use sort of shocks like emergency room visits, like car accidents that are hard to kind of intertemporally shift versus, procedure appointments that like have more of that flexibility. And I'm wondering if you're able to kind of get some traction, like observe it in the data and maybe use that to sort of, gain some traction on this sort of intertemporal substitution versus moral hazard component.
Yeah, so that's great. So at in the reduced form, I had at the beginning like I didn't separate exactly by ED, but but I separated in inpatient and outpatient, which you can assume is some level of urgency. And what I saw in the reduced like model-free evidence is that there was traction of both. And what I mean traction is that there was this dynamic moral hazard going on both, but of course at different levels. In the inpatient was less. It was less actually in size. So at the beginning, I was thinking to have this omega parameter being heterogeneous for inpatient and outpatient spending, just to capture that there are some, some type of care that actually you don't care about the price because you are not gonna, maybe in December I will go after my car accident, right? So I was at first thinking about having this heterogeneous omega by type of like urgency of the care. But at the end of the day, I think I am averaging everything out. So I am capturing, part of spending that probably does not respond too much to price, and part of spending that does. I think I can do better, but I'm not sure if that will be really consequential for the welfare analysis and the counterfactors, given that I am finding dynamic moral hazard in actually both. But I can go like deeper, like ED visits. I have that data.
So one question about the intertemporal substitution. So one question about the intertemporal substitution, and then one stupid thought that may be helpful if you have the data. For the intertemporal substitution, can you see that the more that families spend beyond the MDE in year T, the greater the decrease below some expected in year T plus one? Like, can you see that, like, if somebody crosses, you have two families and they have similar trends until they get to the MDE, and family A just, for lack of a better word, treats it like an open bar for the balance of the year. Family B doesn't. Does A have a bigger decrease in expenditures below MDE in the next year? That might be a descriptive way that you could parse that.
I can definitely look at something like that in the data, for sure, yes.
Awesome. Second, because the weekly data aspect of this is fascinating. Do you have ICD codes or reason for you do?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I aggregated everything at the week level, but I have the claim level, granular, ICDs, everything. It's the run data.
Okay. I've never, I feel like a bad health economist for admitting this. I've never really gotten stuck into that data. So if it would be amazing if you could look at after people cross the MDE. Do you see either A, increased utilization by males under the age of 30? I'm thinking ex ante moral hazard here. Or B, do you see, can you trace it to ICD codes for injuries for things like broken arms, methamphetamine usage or other things that might include, just be indicative of more risky behaviors? Be a different paper, not this one, but
Yeah,
I'm
totally with you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I have been exploring some these measures of risky behaviors in other paper looking at with the run data about opioids and opioid consumption, and it's pretty rich. So I think, drinking behavior, you can see a lot of things, yes. So I have the data.
Okay.
Probably not for this paper, but we can talk later
Yeah,
for
okay,
another
fine.
paper. Thanks for the suggestions.
Other questions?
I can just yell and try to get it right into the microphone.
Okay.
And this might have been like something you did and I just missed it, but it seems hard to separate out. If I have healthcare and I've said this too, I go to the doctor, then I'm more likely conditional that to have another medication or that leads to a surgery, and there's kind of just this changes. But does this allow you to just look at, like, am I sensitive if my family member on a shared deductible plan gets closer to that, then does mine change? Is that like a focus of this? Because you have families and then you have individuals. Is that how this works out? That it kind of focuses on that? Does that make sense?
Okay, so just to clarify, you're thinking of how the other family members' consumption affect my own consumption through this getting closer to the deductible?
Yes, if you can isolate that. Because, when my partner had our child or something, then I threw on my healthcare and
Yeah.
surgeries and things.
Yeah. So actually, it's a cool paper. The what to expect when we are expecting, which is exactly about that. Like, the partner is pregnant, so you for sure that year you will hit the deductible. So if they look at the male, consumption of healthcare, without data from the run, with data from the RAND, there is a paper exactly studying that, what is the effect of my family members' consumption or my own consumption through, it's a JPAV, I think, it's like this year or last year published. So they look at exactly kind of the intra-family behavior. I would say that in a way, how the behavior of my family members affect my own consumption through the nonlinear contract.
In your dynamic,
I
same
mean,
kind.
they don't do it in a dynamic center, but what they show is that they actually, your family members contributing to your own deductible actually allows you to also contribute more. So, or somehow you respond more. They don't call it, they don't say like it's kind of a moral hazard. It's an extra moral hazard if you think, setting. So those about those things. I think you have a question. So if I understood correctly, the first part was about how I can separate the fact that if I have a broken arm today, then probably next week I will have to get some medications, some checkups. So there will be like a follow-up episode to my first episode, something like that. I mean, you didn't ask that.
That was just preamble to my little set of things, which I have to frame my questions better in my own mind before I can
No,
do
sorry,
that.
I need more coffee.
it.
It's me needing more coffee. Sorry. Okay, we can talk more. Yeah.
I do have one question about, there's this general discussion that not all moral hazard is welfare decreasing. And especially in healthcare, there's this whole sector of benign moral hazard. And, obviously when the RAND health insurance was conducted, obviously moral hazard was the welfare decreasing and all those kind of things. But I wonder if you do allow for benign moral hazard in your model, would your welfare discussion or conclusions change? Especially if you let some of the H's actually moral hazard is good for them.
Yeah, I think that question comes back to something my model doesn't have now, which is the health production of aspect, right? Because we can think that by increasing our spending, we are also improving our health, and that decreases the probability to go to a doctor a year from now, 2 years from now. It's true that the RAN experiment actually found that people in more generous insurance, they actually didn't improve their health, which is somehow at odds. I think is related to the short span of the experiment. But I am totally on board with including some source of health capital that can be increased or decreased by higher consumption of healthcare. However, not in this paper because it's pretty hard. But yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? I guess we can break for lunch.
I'm told that lunch is still 5 minutes out, so our options are either more questions or just milling around for a minute.
I think we can just network.
Two quick notes. So if you want to put your lovely new bottle to use, there is a water fountain on this floor by the elevator bank across from the men's restroom over there. And then yes, lunch will be available imminently just outside the room in the foyer. You're welcome to eat in here. There's nice tables in the foyer, but you might want to take advantage of the sunshine breaking through the clouds on our patio over here, this side of the building.